Raccoons, bats, foxes, and coyotes. What do all these animals have in common? They're all common carriers of rabies. As a biology major and future veterinary student, diseases such as rabies are of particular interest to me. That being said, rabies doesn't just affect animals. It can affect humans as well. As such, today I'll be talking about the progression of rabies with a particular focus on humans. First, I will talk about how the disease can be transmitted. Then I'll talk about the early stages. And lastly, I'll talk about the late stages of rabies and preventative measures that can be taken, as well as death resulting from it. Now that we've had a brief introduction to rabies, we can talk about how the disease can be transmitted. Any mammal can get the disease or spread the disease, ourselves included. However, there are certain mammals that are more common carriers, as I addressed in the beginning of my speech. In Nebraska, the two that we have to worry about are raccoons and bats. Now, there are other mammals that can get it, but those are two of the most common carriers. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's website on April 22nd, 2011, the most common mode of contamination of rabies is through the bite and virus-containing saliva of an infected host. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only way you can get it. The virus can also be transmitted through infection of mucous membranes, aerosol transmission, as well as corneal and organ transplants. In fact, rabies can even be transmitted from human to human. And this can occur through biting, believe it or not. Unfortunately, that is something you have to worry about with other humans sometimes, as well as through organ transplants, as I just said. And as such, this is something that must be considered in the medical community when considering organ donors as well as organ recipients, so as to not spread the disease further and result in possible death of another patient. Since rabies is a disease that can be contracted and spread so easily, I have here a globe so that we can discuss areas where risk is higher. So since we are in the US, we'll start with the US. So in the US, the risk is actually fairly low, as well as in Canada. However, still in North America, Mexico actually has a very high risk of the disease. Also, the northern parts of South America have a very high risk of the disease. Moving on from there, the entire continent of Africa also has a very high risk of rabies, as does the eastern parts of Europe and all of Asia. Now, people that travel to those areas, or live in those areas for that matter, must take this into consideration and remember just how big of a risk rabies is in those areas and think about how they want to approach that so that they ensure that they don't get it. Continuing on from there, once the disease has been contracted, the early stages of it can begin. The U.S. National Library of Medicine's Medline Plus website, last updated on August 31st, 2014, states that the time between the exposure to rabies and the actual sickness can range from 10 days up to 7 years. Now, it should be noted that these are extreme cases. In fact, it's on average about 3 to 12 weeks between exposure and sickness, and this period is referred to as the incubation period. Now, since we are talking about the incubation period, I have here a diagram, courtesy of healthyhens.com in 2015, that should explain pretty well what happens during that incubation period. Now, I apologize that it's hard to read. It's just the video quality on this. But so this assumes that the transmission is through biting, which makes sense because it's the most common, as I said. So from there, the virus actually replicates in the muscle at the area of the bite. After that, it proceeds up the peripheral nervous system, into the central nervous system, and into the brain, where it can cause fatal encephalitis. From there, the virus travels to the salivary glands and to the organs, which is why it's such a common mode of transmission there. Now, continuing on from there, the CDC website listing from April 22nd, 2011, excuse me, also says that early symptoms of the disease resemble flu-like symptoms. Now, I'm sure many of you have had the flu before, so you know what that feels like. But as a general overview, this can include general weakness or discomfort, fever, and headache, and this can persist for days. However, in addition to this, rabies can also cause a prickling or itching sensation at the site of the bite, if that's how transmission occurred, as well as things such as cerebral dysfunction, anxiety, confusion, and agitation. On top of that, the patient may experience delirium, abnormal behavior, hallucinations, and even insomnia. Now, this explains why there is the common knowledge that an infected animal, or even human for that matter, may not act as you'd expect them to, and it's all because of rabies' effects on the brain. This acute period may last 2 to 10 days before ending our next topic, late stages of the disease. After this acute period, the chances of survival of rabies are slim to none. According to the Medline Plus website from April 31st, 2014, once symptoms appear, the person rarely survives the epidemic, despite treatment. And this is due to the fact that rabies can lead to coma and even death. And this death usually occurs due to respiratory failure within 7 days of the symptoms appearing. That is very, very quickly. However, it is possible to survive the disease if vaccination occurs soon after exposure. In fact, no one in the U.S. has ever developed rabies when the vaccine is administered properly and promptly and appropriately. In fact, despite all this, though, the best method to prevent rabies is to take preventative measures. Now, there are many ways to do this. The first one being to avoid foreign animals. Now, this can be whether animals are domestic or wild. You never know if that animal is infected with rabies, even if they're not, showing it in general terms. Another way to avoid rabies is to keep pets up to date with vaccinations. Now, this is why the veterinary clinic sends you the little postcard reminding you to give your pets their shots. It's for rabies and also other vaccinations. And this isn't just to keep your pet from dying, which is a good thing, obviously, but also if your pet were to contract the disease from somewhere else, especially if they're outdoor pets, it can bring it back to you and your family and give it to you as well. Another preventative measure is to get vaccinated yourself if you are a particular risk. Now, this can be whether you're in some of the areas I discussed, or if you are like me and will be working in the veterinary field or at a humane society or kennel or some sort. Now, I have a diagram here, which includes a few images showing where the shots are given. And so in humans, they will be given here in the shoulder area. And once again, I'm really sorry, these are hard to see. It's the quality of the video. But the shoulder area, as well as the outside parts of the thigh, and then also the back of the shoulder. However, it should not be administered in the gluteal area. As for animals, as you can see here, there's a vet doing an example here. For dogs and cats alike, they just take a pinch of neck skin and inject the vaccination there. So, moving on from that, the last way to prevent rabies is to follow quarantine guidelines when dealing with rabid animals. Now, it's pretty common sense that obviously you should avoid the animal, but the animal should also be secluded from other animals. And if you do have to deal with the animal, you should proceed with extreme caution so as not to contract the disease yourself. So this should cover rabies pretty well in its progression. To summarize our main points, all mammals are susceptible to the disease, and the most common form of contraction is through biting. It usually takes about 3 to 12 weeks for sickness to actually begin, and once it does, there are flu-like symptoms as well as others. And after the symptoms present, the person rarely survives. So as I said, it can even be transmitted from human to human, whether that be through a bite or an organ transplant. And once it does, the symptoms are various, but the most serious of which affect the brain and behavior of the individual. After that period, which lasts about 2 to 10 days, it proceeds into the late stages of the disease, and death usually occurs even with treatment. As such, vaccination should occur as soon as possible after exposure, but the best method to avoid rabies is to take preventative measures. Potential carriers of rabies are all around us every day. That's why it is important, especially in the case of people with pets, but that is why it's important to always keep rabies in mind so that it doesn't affect you or your loved ones. Although it may not always be considered a serious threat of humans or the first disease that comes to mind, it is important to remember just how serious rabies can be. Thank you.